Rabbi Nili, can you hear me? Hello? Oh, I cannot hear you.
Testing. How about now? Can you hear me now? Hello? Can you hear me? Testing, 1, 2, 3. Okay, sound issues. It says my microphone is working, but I'm not getting any response from the students. Hello, hello. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
I cannot
Joseph,
hear you.
You can't hear me? Because it says it's working now. What about now? Testing. All right, I think you're going to need to check your in now if it's still not coming through. And I can double check over here. Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine.
I cannot hear you at all.
I can double check over here. All right, so yeah, it is coming through on YouTube. So I think there might be something wrong with your setting.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Are your speakers muted? I know I've had that problem sometimes. Okay, sorry everyone who's just joining us. Please stand by as we try to sort out the technical difficulty here. It's good to be back. Good to be together again. And we'll get started again in just a second once we've figured out what the audio connection is for one of the other students. It's important for everyone to be able to hear. Otherwise, it makes it kind of hard to participate. The fourth chapter of Yadayim gets very interesting as it is a quite diverse collection of different elements of Jewish law. We'll just wait for the person to log back in so that we can get through the introduction and discussion. I hope everybody has had a wonderful time during the Chagim, during the festivals. I hope you had a good Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Sukkot and Shmini Atzeret Simchat Torah and all of the other celebrations that go along with those. And now that we are back into the more mundane cycle of life, it's good to be getting back into our Mishnah study together. Just another couple minutes of considerate waiting, and then we will get things underway. If I had the patience and the free time for doing video editing, I'd go back in and delete these long delays as we start, but I'm afraid video editing is something that I really, really find tedious and painful. I know some people are whizzes at it and enjoy it greatly, but for me, the thought of going back and fine tuning the cuts and transitions and all of those sorts of things, just yep, not gonna lie, it's not my favorite thing to do. I don't mind editing documents for hours on end, trying to find just the right texts and to arrange them in just the right order, and sometimes to even dress up the way they are presented, graphics and whatnot. But when it comes to video editing, there's something about it that just drives me up the wall. Well, that may be enough about me. I think we're going to go ahead and get started, rain or shine, as they say. And hopefully the reboot is not causing too much trouble on the other end. But I do want to see if we can't make a sizable dent in chapter 4 and see what we can do. We are almost at the end of Yadayim. A reminder for those of you who are not frequent attendees that we will be moving on to Beitzah for the Masechet after Yadayim. But for now, let's go ahead and pick up chapter 4, verse number 1. And I'm just going to do one more check on the YouTube channel to make sure I am being heard. But for now, yep, there's definitely me on that other on the YouTube. So I don't think I'm talking into a vacuum, and I think there is a recording. Okay, so we are in chapter 4, Mishnah number 1. Dr. Kulp makes the tongue-in-cheek reference that here we are, having just finished chapter 3 with the stirring discussion of Kohelet and Shir HaShirim, with this notion of are they fit for being in the Tanakh? And of course they are, and their beauty and glory. And it mentioned that these were decided by Yom Hahu, on that day. Now, on that day, as we talked about in our last session, is referring to that day when there was a, well, coup. It was a bloodless coup, but the rabbis had had enough of Rabban Gamliel, embarrassing Rabbi Yoshua, and more generally, the way he ran the Beit HaMidrash and the Sanhedrin, the way he ran the study and the court system. And so they deposed him, and they replaced him with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Remember that name, it will be important later. And on that day that they replaced him, they made a number of momentous decisions. The implications is that these topics were up for debate, but had not been settled. Much like the modern legislative process, the rabbi in this time period, who was the head of the Sanhedrin, could control the docket, could control what came up for a vote and what didn't. And a number of these topics apparently had been of public concern within the Beit Midrash, but had not actually gone for a vote. But on the day that he was deposed, on Beyom Hahu, they took a number of votes and settled the matters once and for all. One of those topics was Kohelet and Shir HaShirim, although certainly the question had already been settled prior to that they were part of the collective body of Jewish literature, but more that they had exactly the same status as all other elements of Tanakh at that point. But that's not the only topic. Instead, we're going to look at a topic that I'm sure many of you will consider to be less consequential. On that day, by Yom Hahu, the votes were counted and they decided that a footbath holding from 2 logs to 9 calves, which was cracked, could contract midras uncleanness. I told you we're going to be talking about a lot of different topics. Here's one that we've touched on before, but we've definitely not gone into too much depth, and we're not going to today as well. Midras uncleanness is the uncleanness that comes from having been sat upon by a person who is by themselves unclean. And that is something that we are mindful of when a person is in a state of uncleanliness. In
Most
order
cameras
that
score this as risky driving.
sorry, just heard someone else log through, that this was something that was meant to be taken seriously, that if you sit on something. Hello?
He was a friend,
I can hear somebody's intro
a
coming through.
mentor.
Well, I'm muting the only person who's unmuted. I apologize if that's not the right one, but I want to have only one audio stream at a time. So the issue with midras uncleanness that we're dealing with here is what counts as being something that can be sat upon. Here we have a foot bath, which it's a foot bath. So it shouldn't be a seat, as midras uncleanness only applies to things you sit upon, chairs, saddles, stools, that sort of thing. But the rabbis voted and decided that if it is this size of foot bath, but is cracked, then it is now chair-ish. It is seat-like. And at that point, it can now contract midras uncleanness. The crack means that it is no longer working to hold liquids. It is no longer really a foot bath. Now it is just a box that would probably make a very convenient stool. So the rabbis, the majority voted and said, indeed, this would now just count as a stool, even though it was made for a very different purpose, that the crack had now turned it into a chair rather than having it be a bath. However, Rabbi Akiva said a foot bath must be considered according to its designation. So Rabbi Akiva says that really a foot bath is going to be anything that is called a foot bath, even if it is larger than that 9 kavs, that there shouldn't be an upper limit, that it should go based upon whatever its terminology is. And that in that case, it would then still be susceptible to midras impurity, even if it was larger and now was being used as a chair, it would still be okay. Now, this is a very complicated level of argument and a little bit obtruse. I'm not going to go into too much details on this, but it's the contrast is what Dr. Kolp is talking about between the heights of Shir HaShirim versus the minutia of the midras uncleanness. What I would like to draw your attention to is that we are now getting a set of things that were decided, that we have this backlog of material that needs to be resolved. And yes, it may not feel like this foot bath question is the most outstanding issue that our community needs to know, but the community needed to know. And for whatever reason, Rabban Gamliel was not allowing this to come to the floor to be debated and voted upon. So instead, they went ahead and voted it once they had kicked him out. Okay. Like I said, someday we'll go through the issues of uncleanness, but are there any questions in general about the flow of what we are dealing with here? Okay. So on Mishnah chapter 4:2, we continue with another Bayom Hahu, another issue that was resolved on that day after Rabban Gamliel had been deposed. I should point out that it's important that these things were done hurriedly because Rabban Gamliel was not out of office for very long. There was a reconciliation between him and Rabbi Yoshua, and eventually Rabban Gamliel was put back, although he took turns with Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. So you can really feel here that the change of the parliament, to use a modern term, was seized upon by the majority of the rabbis to vote on important topics in order that there could be a final resolution for many of these points. All right, so here we are going to be talking about korbanot, about sacrifices. On that day, they said, all animal sacrifices which have been sacrificed under the name of some other offering are nevertheless valid. We're going to hit the exceptions in just a second, but let's make sure we get the general rule that they're laying down. So they vote that if somebody offers a sacrifice, even one that has been offered that was being offered with the wrong name, so they brought it as a free will offering, but it should have been a peace offering, or rather they called it a peace offering, but it was actually a free will offering or meant to be a free will offering. Nonetheless, the sacrifice is still a kosher sacrifice. Now that's important for a number of reasons. One, depending upon where in the sacrificial service this was discovered, if it was offered incorrectly, normally an incorrect offering is simply destroyed, it is disposed of, and the blood that was gathered from the offering cannot be sprinkled on the altar. If it was a type of offering that is meant to be eaten, it can't be eaten. There are a lot of implications if this is recognized. And of course, if it is recognized later, then that could also be considered a potential problem. So what the rabbis voted here to agree on is that if the offering was offered by the wrong name, but was otherwise still the correct offering, it still has to be what should be offered for that moment, it is considered to be a correct and valid offering. But they are not accounted to their owners as fulfillment of obligations, meaning that if you had made a vow, an oath to bring an offering, but then when you went to bring the offering, you designated it incorrectly, not as what you had vowed to bring, then you still have to bring an offering to fulfill the vow, even though the one you have brought will be accepted, with the exception of the Pesach and the sin offering. So the Pesach and the Chatat are offered, and if it is offered, but it is offered incorrectly, meaning with the wrong designation, then it is completely disqualified, that it is not allowed at all. So basically, if you are bringing a lamb and it is supposed to be the Pesach offering, but for whatever reason you tell the Kohen that it is a peace offering, then it cannot be considered the actual peace. It cannot be considered either a peace offering or a Passover offering. It is simply null and void. So too, a sacrifice done for a chatat, for a sin offering, particularly because it has to be done for a particular sin. If it is misdesignated, then it does not count, and it cannot be, the sacrificial service cannot carry on. This is true of the Pesach in its correct time and the sin offering at any time. Now, this is only, as the commentary points out, that they will be disqualified, well, the sin offering anytime, but the Pesach offering only if it is being offered at the actual time when a Pesach offering is supposed to be offered. Now, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that you can offer your Passover offering in September. It means that if you offered a Passover offering in September, and it turns out that you mislabel it as a non-Passover offering, it can still count as a free will offering, and that will be fine. But obviously it wouldn't count as a Passover offering. But a Passover offering that is mislabeled during the time that a Passover offering is meant to be offered, that is now nothing. It is completely null and void. Any questions on that? Oh, I see a hand up. Yes.
Yes, and Rav, question for you. What happens if there's a messenger, okay, and a sheliach for the hatat, and the sheliach did a mistake? Also, they disqualify the sacrifice. Also, when the mistake was made by the sheliach.
I would think yes, that a shaliach acts as an agent for the person who sent it. So a shlichut would mean that they are acting like the person. And more to the point, whatever the original intention was, the actual intention of the Kohen is going to be wrong when the Kohen begins the sacrificial service. So the fact is, it's just an error at that point, and there is no way to switch it to something else. So yes, you should be careful while doing these things. Rabbi Eliezer is going to disagree. Rabbi Eliezer says, with the exception also of the guilt offering, so that this refers to the Pesach in its correct time and to the sin offering and guilt offerings at any time. So he is saying that the Asham would also be disqualified if it was mislabeled. But of course, he is a minority view, and this whole section is about the majority voting. And so his opinion, while respected, was not the opinion that carried the day. And as we'll see here from Rabbi Shimon ben Azai, I received a tradition from the 72 elders on the day when they appointed Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, head of the college, the whole day that we are talking about here, that all animal sacrifices which are eaten and which have not been sacrificed under their own name are nevertheless valid, but they are not accounted to their owners as a fulfillment of their obligations, with the exception of Pesach and the sin offering. So Ben Azai only added.
But it's exactly the opposite, no? He said the opposite.
No, the English I agree is confusing. So what he's trying to say here is that the sacrifices that are offered under their own name are valid. Sorry, that are offered under the wrong name are valid, but they do not fulfill an obligation, which is the same as we began with the exception of the Pesach and sin offering, which do neither. And that's I agree that the language of the Mishnah can be hard to follow sometimes. It's the abbreviations are not always easy. And then we get the continuation here. This is true of the Pesach in its correct time and the sin offering at any time, which goes along to reinforce what Ben Azai was saying up till this point. And we're not going to look through all of this. Commentary you're welcome to look at is pointing out that you can go look at the longest version of this whole coup d'etat with Barachot 27b. Okay, now Mishnah 3 from chapter 4 is a long one, but it's fairly straightforward, kind of. But there's a lovely shaklavataria of the back and forth of the debate, and we have to understand a few of the underlying questions that are going on here. The basic question here are the issues of tithing and the issue of Shemitah, of the 7th year sabbatical for the land. And on top of that, we need to understand geography, the borders of the land of Israel. Now, it's really easy to get confused about the borders of the land of Israel because there is biblical discussion of their borders multiple times, but the rabbis took the most clear and narrow description of the borders of Israel, which would be quite familiar to most people when looking at Israel today. So, for example, the Jordan River was the easternmost border of the official land of Israel. The East Bank, what we would now call the modern country of Jordan, was outside the land of Israel, even though we had 2.5 tribes with land in that area. On the eastern bank. Nevertheless, that land was not considered to be inside the land of Israel. Now, for those of you who have longed for the so-called Greater Israel movement, that may seem a little problematic to you. However, the ultimate proof of this idea that land is not officially part of Israel and thus not subject to the Torah's rules of sabbatical growth, is the fact that Moses was there. And Moses never went to Israel. Quite famously, Moses never stepped foot in the land of Israel. So if Moses stood on the easternmost bank of the Jordan River and was not in the land of Israel, then that's not the land of Israel. And simply that is the end of the argument. Now, at that point, we do have to understand that rabbinically, that land was considered to be part of Israel for the purpose of doing the sabbatical release of the land growth. So in the end, it, quote, doesn't make a difference, but it does make a difference, as we're going to see. So in general, the idea of where the sabbatical year applies and where the tithing happens is rather important, because there is a system of tithes that follow the 7-year cycle. And if you'll just bear with me a minute, I wrote down that wonderful list of the tithes in order for us to review it together. And where did I put it? There we are. Nope. There we are. Right. Okay. So in the first year of every 7-year cycle, and the second and fourth and fifth years, we have the Maaser Rishon, what's known as the first tithes, which you can see Dr. Kolb discussing down here. And the first tithes are the tithes that are given to the Levites. And then in the and then the Maaser Sheni are also given in the in the first, second, fourth, and fifth years, and those are the special separation of the tithing of produce and fruits. Now, in the third and sixth years, the Maaser Sheni and Maaser Ani are also separated. Now, the second one there is the tithing for the poor. Now, you may notice that there is no tithing in the 7th year. Well, that's because in the 7th year, it is the biblical release, which means no one has any produce because it doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to everyone. So there's nothing to actually tithe. However, what happens if you live outside of that land that is being governed by the sabbatical release? Shouldn't you be tithing in year number 7? Because you still have property that you own during that time. So that's the fundamental issue at debate here. Now, we're not going to go into a whole lot more because it's just gets very, very complicated. But let's see how this works out with the geography question. On that day, they said, again, Arbayom Hahude, what is the law applying to Ammon and Moab in the 7th year? This is the eastern bank of the Jordan. Rabbi Tarfon decreed tithe for the poor, that this should be the tithe for poor people. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah decreed it's the second tithe, the Maaser Sheni. Now, that means we have a argument. Now, notice, like I pointed out earlier, that Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is involved in this debate and this discussion. He is the new head of the Beit Midrash. He is the replacement for Rabban Gamliel. And notice how he engages in this discussion. Rabbi Ishmael said, Elazar ben Azariah, you must produce your proof because you are expressing the stricter view. And whoever expresses a stricter view has the burden to produce the proof. This is a point that I've mentioned in many classes before, but here is one of the more famous examples of it, that the one who comes to be strict is the one who actually has to produce the proof. I know in the modern sociological world of Jewish life, everybody is only too eager to always take a no and a forbidden position, but that's not traditional, ironically. That if you are involved in a stricter point of view, then it is up to you to prove that what you are demanding is more correct, because you are the one who is imposing a greater burden upon the people. You are demanding a new element. In many ways, you are taking more from them. and thus you have to be the one to produce that proof. The person arguing against you doesn't have to produce proof for their leniency, because their leniency would seem to be the default. Now, what is the strictness versus the leniency in this? Well, the Maaser Sheni, the second tithe, is considered to be kadosh. It is considered to be have a level of sanctity to it, a holiness to it, as opposed to the Maaser Oni, or Ani, which is the tithe for the poor, which does not have the same ritual level to it. So since you are putting this additional burden on the way the tithing is done, you're the one who has to bring proof. Aaron.
Yes, Rabbi. Just out of curiosity, isn't there often a debate whether which side is the strict side and which side is the lenient side?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Trying to establish what is strict and what is lenient in any given case is often subject to debate. Sometimes it's fairly clear. Here, it definitely seems that the Maaser Sheni is the more demanding type of tithe. And so strictness to that does seem to be a more logical designation. But in many other circumstances, it is not always clear what is being strict or what is being lenient. Even more likely is to be in a situation where if you are being strict on one opinion, you are being lenient on another aspect. So for example, if you are being very strict on your definition of glatt kosher, to the point that you are throwing away hundreds and hundreds of pounds of meat and driving the price of kosher meat through the roof, then you are being strict on the definition of smooth lungs, but you are being very lenient in your definition of wasting. And as Bal Tashchit is also a mitzvah, indeed, it's a mitzvah in the Torah, unlike the glatt designation, which is an additional stringency upon kashrut itself. Then being strict on one means you are being weak on the other. And to be strict on one, the opposite would mean to be weak on the other. So sometimes, yes, there are things that are in counterposition. But here, where we're dealing with two things that are quite similar and the relative strictness seems pretty apparent.
But Rabbi, on that example you just gave, is there any opinion about the intended consequence? For the example you gave, the intended consequence is to be strict on kashrut food. The unintended consequence is that you don't waste. So even though you're more lenient on the not wasting part, that was an unintended consequence of the rule.
It's an unintended consequence, but it's not one that you are at liberty to violate simply because it's unattended. It's like saying, I wanted his money, and the unintended consequence was the fact that he died in the robbery. But I had no intention. I didn't care whether he lived or died. I was just after the cash. Therefore, you should only prosecute me as a thief, not as a murderer. Well, no, because you did actually cause the other damage as well, even if it was an unintended consequence. So yes, sometimes there may be truly unintended consequences, and that's often very important in Shabbat discussions. But in kashrut or here, I think we are still quite clearly in the initial consequence realm. Now, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is going to respond. He's been called out. He has to provide proof for his opinion. And here is his response. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said to him, Ishmael, my brother, I have not deviated from the sequence of years. Tarfon, my brother, has deviated from it, and the burden of proof is upon him to produce the proof. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is saying, look, I'm just following the normal pattern of how many years we skip and what we do on the Maaser Sheni and when we do the tithing for the poor. This seems to be the normal pattern. It's the third and sixth years that we give to the poor. And that means that the year after, it seems logical that it's going to be the second tithe. The same way that the year after the third year, when we do the poor tithe, is also the second tithe. So I'm just following the pattern. I'm not trying to be strict. I'm just following the pattern. If you don't have the sabbatical release of year number 7 because you live outside of Israel, then you should just keep following the same pattern for year 7 that has been up to that point. It's a very logical point. And he then argues that since he's not actually being strict, it's not on him to produce proof. Tarfon, who's actually changing things, he is the one obligated to provide proof, because how can you justify changing the pattern for year 7 that was clear of years 1 through 6? Okay. And Rabbi Tarfon answered, Egypt is outside the land of Israel. Ammon and Moab are outside the land of Israel. Just as Egypt must give tithe to the poor in the 7th year, so must Ammon and Moab give tithe to the poor in the 7th year. All right, so Rabbi Tarfon realizes that he does need to produce proof, that this isn't an issue of stringency, so the burden of proof falls on his feet first. And he says, look, we do know that Egypt has to provide the poor tithe in year number 7. That seems to establish a precedent that Egypt, which is outside the land of Israel, has to provide a poor tithe. Therefore, so should Ammon and Moab, which are also outside the land of Israel. They should follow the same pattern that has already been established, which apparently no one argued with, that the Egyptian Jews had to follow the pattern of giving a poor tithe in year number 7. Okay. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah answered, Babylon is outside the land of Israel. Ammon and Moab are outside the land of Israel. Just as Babylon must give second tithe in the 7th year, so must Ammon and Moab give second tithe in the 7th year. Well, if you're going to play by the game of if it's outside Israel, it can follow the pattern of other things outside Israel, then I should point out to you that in Babylon too, they have this issue with the 7th year of what to give. And in Babylon, it was decreed that they have to give the second tithe. And that was decreed according to, as we're going to see, according to in the time of the prophets, of the Nevi'im, at the end of the Babylonian exile. So in Babylon, they decreed 7th year is second tithe. In Egypt, done by the sages later on, they decreed that 7th year was the poor tithe. So both of them can point to parallel cases to support their position of what is happening outside the borders of Israel. With me so far? All right. Like I said, this is a great example of the back and forth of the debate. Rabbi Tarfon said, on Egypt, which is near, meaning near to Israel, they imposed tithe for the poor so that the poor of Israel might be supported by it during the 7th year. And so on Ammon and Moab, which are near, we should impose tithe for the poor so that the poor of Israel may be supported by it during the 7th year. So now Rabbi Tarfon comes back and says, but there is a logic. Yes, we can have an example from Babylon and Egypt of how it could go either way. Great. But now we have to look at the underlying logic of why it was chosen differently for Egypt compared to Babylon. And what do I think, says Rabbi Tarfon? I think that the Egyptian position that it was chosen to be a tithe for the poor was chosen in order to support the poor people of Israel, because Egypt and Moab, Egypt would be close to Israel. And thus, if there was poor in Israel that didn't have enough to be supported on the land of Israel during the sabbatical year because of the changes of agriculture during that time, they would be able to look to their brethren in Egypt to provide support. Ammon and Moab are also very close, and thus we would expect them to be in the same situation, which is they should be ready to provide the help for the poor in order that the poor of Israel can be supported during that 7th year. So he is arguing that the underlying reason for the difference between Egypt and Babylon has to do with the support they would provide, and thus Ammon and Moab would follow the rule of Egypt rather than the rule of Babylon, which is much further. And may I point out, there is some precedent, as we're going to see as we read through the book of Bereshit over the next few months, of people in the land of Israel needing to go to Egypt because there was a famine in the land of Israel. So this does indeed seem very geographically and historically supported. But since it wasn't explicitly said that this applied to Ammon and Moab, we are still having a debate. Again, this is why it is being argued about and voted on this day. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said to him, rebuttal, behold, you are like one who would benefit them with grain, yet you are really as one who causes them to perish. Wow, harsh. Would you rob the heavens so that dew or rain should not descend? As it is said, will a man rob God? Yet you rob me. But you, how have you robbed me? In tithes and heave offerings, the truma. So this is a quote from Malachi. And in the prophet Malachi, he is saying that God is saying that people are cheating on their tithing. And as such, they are suffering agriculturally. God is withholding the blessings of heaven, the dew and the rain. If you didn't know, those are the main blessings from heaven that we talk about in this way. Well, that's why we had the special prayer for Geshem that we just recited on Shmini Atzeret, and which is now part of our Givorot. So basically what Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is saying is, sure, you may think that putting aside the tithe for the poor is going to help the poor, but in fact, by not giving the proper tithe, which is the second tithe in my opinion, you are cheating God. And if you cheat God, God is going to make the rain and dew not fall. And that means that everyone is going to suffer from the drought that's going to happen. So you're not helping anyone by causing a drought, would be the short way of describing his opinion. All right. So if this feels a little bit like a tennis match or like a football game, trying to move the ball back and forth for position on the field, excellent. You're paying attention. Let's go ahead and add another voice into the mix. Come on. Rabbi Joshua said, behold, I shall be as one who replies on behalf of Tarfon, my brother, but not in accordance with the substance of his arguments. So Rabbi Joshua is saying, I'm going to say that Rabbi Tarfon is right in his point, but he's wrong in his arguments, in the logic behind them. I agree that Ammon and Moab should follow the same pattern of doing the poor tithe, but not for the reasons that he advanced. Why then? The law regarding Egypt is a new act, and the law regarding Babylon is an old act. Remember, as I mentioned, the law regarding Egypt was established according to the sages, which means it was after the time of the prophets, whereas the law regarding Babylon was established during the prophetic period. And the law which is being argued before us is a new act. This is also in the time of the sages, not the time of the prophets, because, that's why we're arguing about it today. A new act should be argued from another new act, but a new act should not be argued from an old act. So the law regarding Egypt is the act of the elders, and the law regarding Babylon is the act of the prophets. And the law which is being argued before us is the act of the elders. Let one act of the elders be argued from another act of the elders, but let not an act of the elders be argued from an act of the prophets. So Rabbi Joshua is weighing in and saying, look, you can't establish precedent from which to argue for a new opinion, not an interpretation of Torah law, but a new implementation of rabbinic law. You can't make that sit on a prophetic position, because the time of the prophets were singular, they were unique. And while they are still useful for discussing and interpreting D'Oraita, Torah laws, they cannot be used as precedent. When the prophets acted in a particular way, it was due to divine inspiration. It was due to prophetic insight. It was not due to the argument and reasoned and discussed position of the sages. A prophet could simply promulgate. They could simply say, this is the position for this period. And that is not a firm foundation from which to argue other opinions later on, which, quite frankly, have to stand up in front of the peers and be reviewed, be debated, and be voted upon. Nobody votes on prophets, and certainly no one votes on the prophetic decrees. But we are the elders, we are the sages, and we have to present things that can be argued upon on the even playing field, with no one being gifted prophetic insight and thus special pleading for their position. Let me get Dr. Kulp's opinions down here so that we can understand that. And as you can see, oh, there we are. The votes were counted, and they decided that Ammon and Moab should give tithe for the poor in the 7th year. So after the back and forth, we get the vote, and Rabbi Joshua and Rabbi Tarfon, by extension, win in that argument. Now, before we get down to the next section, just understand that what we have just seen is what we should always see. That Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, even though he is the head of the court, is not using his position to prejudice the decision. He is arguing from an equal position. He is not using his authority to ram through a decision. He is arguing with his logic and with his insights and with all that he has been taught from his tradition for his position. And yet, he is outvoted. And when he is outvoted, he loses the position. This is exactly what Rabban Gamliel would never accept. And this is this is what gives the revolution its lasting power in Jewish law, because there was an opportunity here, if you will, or maybe a looming disaster. If Rabban Gamliel had been able to continue in the way that he had, which led to his being deposed, but if he had not been deposed, then it is very possible that Judaism would have ended up with a pope-like figure, with somebody making decisions and edicts by themselves, not subject to any other outside scrutiny or investigation or debate or rebuttal. That it's this way because I'm the head and what I say goes. And it was precisely because of that attitude and the fact that it was rejecting all of the other sages' opinions and traditions that Rabban Gamliel was forced to step down, and why we are now seeing so beautifully Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah play the role of being the head of the court in the proper way, using his skills, using his wisdom, feeding into the discussion so that we all learn and benefit, but doing so in a way that is respectful and is not abusing his position of authority for the rights. And especially that last little section that Rabbi Joshua, who you remember was the victim of Rabban Gamliel most of all, when he argues very specially, I think, that we can't draw conclusions for our debates from the edicts of the prophets. He is, I believe, tacitly saying you can't treat the head of the Beit Din like a prophet. You can't treat the head of the court as somebody who will just know the right answer and no one else is allowed to argue with them. Yes, the prophets had that position and that role. There aren't any prophets now, which means all that is left is clear, open, and fair debate, and ultimately a vote to settle those disputes that are not resolved by themselves. Aaron, you have a question?
Yes, Rabbi. Wasn't the problem with Rabbi Gamliel not that he wasn't letting majority rule, but that he was trying to embarrass or intimidate people who didn't agree with him?
But that's exactly the point. If you say the majority rule is the majority, but if you disagree with me, you're an idiot and I'm going to humiliate you, it has what is often colloquially referred to as a chilling effect, that you basically shut down opposition. If a person knows they will be shamed and humiliated for taking a position opposite you, then who is going to open their mouth and take a position opposite you? And at that point, you no longer have a debate, you no longer have a discussion, you now have a pope. And everyone just sits there and says, well, what do you think? Because I'm not going to tell you what I think, because if I disagree with you, then I'm going to be humiliated. Well, I'm not going to do that. Or worse, you would have a schism in Judaism with those who were willing to follow a pope-like figure following, and those who were not breaking away and becoming a different sect. And Judaism has had enough of sects and breakaway groups, which we'll see also in chapter 4 as we progress.
But
Go ahead.
when didn't they have the rule come along though, where the highest ranking member goes last to avoid situations like this?
That was specifically in capital cases, when somebody might be executed, because
So-
they were so desperate to try and make sure that all the possible arguments for acquittal or mitigation would be given, that they wanted to make sure they didn't prejudice the court by having the highest ranking speaking first.
So, and was there a specific order in non-capital cases, especially cases with issues of law, like?
Well, in general, you would turn to the people who were the most knowledgeable, the most learned, and see what traditions did they have, what received counsel did they have to pass on, and what insights and logic. You have to also remember that there is a taboo of a student giving a ruling in front of their teacher that contradicts their teacher, or indeed even giving a ruling at all in front of their teacher. And so Judaism has always had this tension of respect for the previous generation, for the wisest ones, the seniority within the group, but also trying to ensure a free and open debate and discussion. And really what we're seeing here in Mishnah 3 is the best of both worlds. We are hearing everything that needs to be said, and people feel free to push back and argue respectfully when they disagree with the current head of the court. And we learn so much more from that than we do if people begin to self-censor themselves out of the study. One of the other things that, if you go back to the section in Brachot and look at the longer discussion in the Talmud that we learn about this whole period, was that more people were allowed into the Beit Midrash on this day. That it wasn't only that they debated and discussed and voted on so much and did so in such a good way, but they benefited from having a larger group of people involved in all of those discussions. It really, I just probably sounds like I'm overstating this and trying to make more of this than there is. And if so, I apologize for my zeal on this point. But this is a critical axis moment for Judaism. We could very easily have drifted into some form of papal authority, where you would not have been able to argue or debate on unsettled issues for fear of being shamed or even cast out by the community. And we weren't there yet, but it was getting close. And that's why the deposition, that's why the coup against Rabban Gamliel was so important. He had to be stopped then, before it had become traditional to give that much authority to the head of the house of study, or else we would have really been doomed, in my humble opinion. And this moment puts us on a path that makes us much more stable for the next almost 2,000 years. And yes, unfortunately, we have flirted in times with people wanting to follow charismatic leaders or authoritarian leaders, of people who will make single edicts without any explanation or brooking no debate. But by and large, the vast majority of Jews, for the vast majority of our history, have recognized what we see here in Mishnah 3 as being the normal. If you have an argument to make it. Once you've made your argument and we've discussed it back and forth, at some point there will be a vote, and that vote will determine the community's behavior, and we're done.
Just out of curiosity, wasn't the makeup of this court different? Because Rabbi Eliezer wasn't the giant that the other heads of the court were, because they passed up Rabbi Joshua, who was a giant, because they didn't want it to look, they didn't want to give him the spot.
They didn't want to
And
make
then
it look too political, really, because he was the main person in the argument.
Right. And then they passed up Rabbi Akiva too, who
Yes.
was the other big giant. So Rabbi Eliezer is like number 3 as far as you know, the biggest giant goes, but he's still head of the court.
Absolutely, and there's a lot of things.
But Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua were older than Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva studied from them. So in this way, actually, there's 1, 2, and Rabbi Akiva is number 3.
But in terms of their prestige within the community, Rabbi Akiva was extremely prestigious, and he was, I guess in the modern sense, you would say he was nominated, but was then disqualified, if you will. And there's a lot that goes in, and we don't really have time to go into the entire section in Brachot. Maybe we can do that as a bonus section before we do Beitza, after we finish Yadayim altogether, because there's a lot going into the decision of how it became Elazar ben Azariah. And it wasn't just their stature. There were many other sociological, economic, and political decisions. But that is exactly the point. They didn't want a king. They didn't want somebody that everybody would bow to. They wanted somebody who would have the necessary stature, but not too much stature. They needed to have this right balance. Really, it's like the old term in British politics of being the prime minister, of being the first among equals, was the idea. Now, modern prime ministerial politics in England is much more like presidential politics in America, although not nearly to the same degree. But this is really trying to find somebody who will be able to lead, but not dominate. And that was where they were going for. Let's finish up this section here on Mishnah 3, because it's a very interesting twist. And when Rabbi Yossi ben Dermaskit visited Rabbi Eliezer in Lod, he said to him, "What new thing did you have in the house of study today?" He said to him, "Their votes were counted, and they decided that Ammon and Moab must give tithe for the poor in the 7th year." So basically he's getting the news. So what was decided? How did it happen? What went on? And he's like, oh, well, this is one of the rulings. Rabbi Eliezer wept and said, "The counsel of the Lord is with them that fear him, and his covenant to make them known it. Go and tell them, don't worry about your voting. I received a tradition from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who heard it from his teacher, and his teacher from his teacher, and so back to halakha given to Moses from Sinai, that Ammon and Moab must give tithe for the poor in the 7th year." Now, the issue here is that Rabbi Eliezer was under cherem at this point. He was excommunicated, and he actually had a tradition. And his tradition was that indeed we do treat Ammon and Moab as being the tithe of the poor in the 7th year. Now, with a valid tradition all the way back to Sinai, back to Moses at Mount Sinai, you don't need to vote. There's no reason to vote. Once you have the actual Torah Sheba'al Peh, the full Masorah that is transmitted from teacher to student, all the way back to Moses, then we don't need to actually vote. As long as it's considered and decided as being a valid tradition, as one that is firm, then that is all we need to know, right? And so the irony here is that there was somebody who wasn't allowed into the debate who actually had a tradition that would have removed the need for the debate. But the debate ended up agreeing with his position, that in the end, they actually do end up with the right position, at least according to Rabbi Eliezer's tradition. So this is, as Dr. Kolb goes on to say, that this is a really interesting, not exactly rebuttal, but a parallel thought that goes along with the idea of, yes, logic and voting is great, but don't forget the Masorah. Don't forget the chain of tradition, that we can't just do whatever we feel like because we all voted to do it, that there are actual traditions that go back farther than us, that go back all the way to Sinai, and thus we can rely on those traditions rather than coming up with logic for our debates and points after the fact. And that is the fundamental tension that remains to this day as a good and healthy tension of what is it that has been received What is it that is our Masorah, if you will, the chain of understanding? And what is it that is still open to logic and reason? What is still open to debate and discussion? Now, the borders of those two are very fuzzy, and people will often get into debates over it, especially here in the conservative movement, where we love to wrestle with these questions and to see whether or not something is actually the full tradition or whether it is merely a chain of legal arguments and decisions that is still open for ongoing debate and discussion. And that is something that requires a great deal of passion and interest in getting to the heart of the matter. It's one of the things I love best about our movement, and it's one of the most daunting aspects of our movement. But I think those of you who are willing to study with me for Mishnah will recognize the benefit of continuing to have those discussions. Yes, Natan.
Yes, what for me is always amazing when I read this is that people believe him. Like, okay, you can say, oh, yeah, Rabbi Eliezer, okay, yes, I received this from my teacher. It's his word. Like, he can lie. You don't have any evidence or proof that really is true, that is an old Masoret from Torah Sinai. It's just what he say. And for me, it's amazing that people really believe and took the word of one of them as okay, it's true. Like no one can lie. See, in order to win the.
Yes and no. So first of all, you're absolutely right that in general, the word of a student that this is the tradition that they received is taken as face value, that they're not making it up. They're not lying about it. No one ever says in the Talmud, you're just making that up. However, people will say in the Talmud, you're mistaken. I know you think that's the tradition you received, but you're misremembering it. You got a word wrong, or you didn't get the second half, or you misunderstood the application, or it wasn't from that rabbi, it was from a different rabbi, and that rabbi's opinion was based on another one, and that was not substantiated. So the Talmud absolutely accepts that when a person brings a tradition that they're not lying, 100%. But that doesn't mean it accepts it as being the end of the argument. It just changes the rules of the argument. Now the argument has to be whether your tradition is a correct and valid one. Not honest. Honest will take, but it could still be a mistake, or it could still be misunderstood. And to me, that is the ultimate sign of respect. Of I believe that you believe what you are saying, but we're still going to examine it. We're still going to make sure that it fits with everything else we know in Judaism and everything else we know in the traditions of whoever's name you're bringing it in. Because if it doesn't, then we can hypothesize that somewhere along the way of transmission, there might have been an error. And as someone I know, Natan, who's done a lot of Talmud study over the last couple of years, I'm sure you are familiar now with that style of argumentation. That's nice, but I think your Breita is flawed.
Now, talking about that, for the lawyers there, I think that who's there?
Aaron.
Aaron is there. Aaron, you must read the WMIT of today, the 105 of Tuvot. This is for lawyers and for judges. Did you read that, Rabbi, today?
I haven't actually read it today, no.
For me, it's one of the most beautiful one about a judiciary system. What is expectation for a judge? And what is a bribe? That is not bribing materially, also verbally.
Yes.
It's an amazing chapter today. 105, Aaron, you must read it. 105 God, you must read it.
The Jewish laws on what counts as a bribe would make American politics impossible.
Yeah, not true.
The definition of a bribe is so broad, and the standard for being scrupulous and careful in all of your decisions is so high that the things that we see happening in American politics, and I'm not talking about people handing money, but inviting someone to a special seminar, where it's going to be at a 5-star hotel with fancy meals. Absolutely, you're no longer allowed to decide that case. Right? You're off the case.
Someone help you, okay,
Yes.
to go down from the boat. I don't
Yes.
know. I need to disqualify myself because you helped me.
Yep.
That's really
Giving you a
that
hand for stepping down the
so
boat.
high bar.
My hat blows off and you bring it back to me. Exactly. It is a very, very high bar, but that's because they understood that without
Mhm.
honest judges, everything else falls apart. Everything else falls apart. Aaron, final comment before we wrap up for tonight.
Right. Back on your Tan's question about receiving a tradition, what was that one where that guy would not redact his opinion based on the fact he claimed he received the tradition, but then told his kids not to follow his opinion because you only heard it from me and not from the many? So
That was the one, the only Rabbi Eliezer that we are talking about right here. And the reason he was in Cherem and not at the court to hear these discussions is exactly the story that you're talking about, the Tanur Shel Achnai, the oven of Achnai. So exactly right. He is the paradigm of tradition, but even he bows to the court, even while he laments that tradition is not given the right weight in the discussion.
so to have it received tradition and to have it accepted, it has to be heard from more than one person, right?
Well, not just that it has to be heard, it has to not only be heard, but it also has to make sense and it has to fit everything else that we know about Jewish law. So if someone says, I have a tradition, and assuming they're not lying, I have a tradition that it's okay to light a fire on Shabbat if you are afraid of the dark, right? No, you heard that wrong. Maybe the rabbi said it's okay to light a fire before Shabbat because you're afraid of the dark, but no, that doesn't fit Jewish law. So your tradition is flawed. I don't think you're a liar, but I think you're misunderstanding or misrepeating. And having heard people repeat things in the name of other rabbis in my own day that I know the other rabbi could not have said, oh, Rabbi so-and-so said it was okay to blah, blah. And I'm like, I don't want to say, no, they didn't, or the rabbi is wrong, because, I don't want to disagree with another rabbi whose opinion I haven't heard directly. But I know that the person reporting that opinion must have gotten something wrong in their memory, because some of the opinions I've heard that people ascribe to other rabbis, it just cannot be what that rabbi said. But that happens. And yes, that's why we debate, discuss, and work together, and we don't rely only on our own memory.
But even if it's not inconsistent for it to be an accepted tradition, doesn't a bunch of people have to vouch for the tradition or no?
It would have to be accepted by the other people, yes. It doesn't mean that they have to vouch for it, but the other people would have to say, oh, okay, that's the tradition then. But it would have to meet the criteria of the community to be validated. And that's the tension, right? And that's part of what I know is frustrating, but personally I love in Judaism, is we don't just say, who cares about your traditions? Who cares about what your rabbi taught you? I only want to know what's logical, what makes perfect sense that I agree with. But on the other hand, we also don't say, I only have my tradition, who needs logic? We are constantly reviewing traditions to make sure they fit the logic of Judaism as a whole. And that tension between tradition and logic is something that has kept Judaism true to everything the Torah wants us to have, meaning both the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah that we need in order to interpret the written Torah, but also the gifts that God gave us to understand our situation and the world around us, so that Torah would always be relevant and meaningful. It's a very beautiful and powerful system, and one that doesn't get enough credit because too many people want either a short, perfect, definitive answer, or they just want to do what they think they understand, and they don't want to hear anyone else's, old stuff and opinions. And both those positions, both of them are just so contrary to what Judaism has fought to maintain for so very long. But we will have to leave it there. I hope we can finish up Yadayim next week. And then the week after, we'll begin Beitzah, unless people would like to go back and look at Brachot and look at the coup in the Talmud in more detail. Let me know out of class if you'd like to or not, but we'll be with Yadayim next week at least. All right, take care, everyone, and be well.